All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built as my royal residence, by my mighty power, and for the glory of my majesty?" Now we know from Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions that he thought a lot of himself. Okay, this completely fits with what we know of himself from his own words. Nebuchadnezzar made a lot of inscriptions to his buildings, and he actually buried them as part of the foundations of his buildings, unlike, say, previous leaders who put their inscriptions up on the walls. He knew that by doing that, by putting the inscriptions on the walls, later rulers who replaced him could just write over those with their own inscriptions. That happened in Egypt. Yeah, that had happened. Part of the reason why we have such a difficult time untangling the knots of ancient history is that the inscriptions left behind on these walls and on these columns, all these statues, were frequently written over by later leaders who wanted to attribute their predecessors' success to themselves. Nebuchadnezzar knew that, so to get around that problem, he buried a lot of his inscriptions in the foundations of his buildings where they couldn't easily be gotten to. In fact, they weren't gotten to until modern archaeologists came along and did in the 1800s, 2,700 years later. 2,500 years later, so pretty smart. But we know he did this, and we know he was a builder. He liked to think of himself as a builder, and we know he was very proud of what he built in Babylon. He was more interested in his accomplishments as a builder than his accomplishments as a warrior. And that's actually kind of different from a lot of the ancient kings. Assyria, all of the Assyrian inscriptions we have talk about how dominant they were. You know, they were very focused on expressing their dominance. I went into that land and I kicked those people's butts and I took them back as captives and I flayed them alive and I hung their skin on the walls of my palace and I did all these terrible things to them because I'm strong and they're weak and I made them into dust. You know, that was a big deal to the Assyrians. That wasn't really a big deal to Nebuchadnezzar. His inscriptions focused more on his efforts as a builder rather than as a destroyer, which is interesting. That's a very interesting difference in their mindsets. He did fight. Okay, we've seen a lot about that. We've seen a lot about the Bible actually focuses more on his exploits as a warrior. Reading about all the invasions he made of the area around Israel and Israel itself, and Phoenicia and Tyre and Egypt later on. So the Bible does talk about his exploits and his conquests and war, but he himself wasn't that interested in that. I guess he probably thought that was just a means into an end, just something he had to do. He liked focusing on his buildings. That's what he cared about. He liked praising himself for building things. And we see that reflected here. The words were still on his lips, so he was still talking even. He was still finishing his thought out loud when a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You'll be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you, until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes." Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. I always think of the Beauty and the Beast. If you've ever seen the Disney movie, the animated version from 1991, or even the live-action version from 2017, the Beauty and the Beast, I think of that. Like when the Beast kicks that old lady, of course, this enchantress disguised as an old lady, kicks her out of his palace for being ugly and wasting his time, and then she turns into an enchantress and curses him and declares that he has to learn to love in order to be into a man again. I view this as something similar to that. Nebuchadnezzar has been turned into basically a beast man here, a man with the mind of a beast. I don't know if, there is an actual psychiatric condition called zoanthropy where people think they're animals. And in that category, there's a specific subcategory called boanthropy, where people think they're bovine, specifically think they're bovine, cows or cattle. And that actually is a documented phenomenon. Now, that may be what is happening to Nebuchadnezzar here, could be. Or he's literally being, transformed, possessed by God to think this. something like this is happening. He apparently is becoming a beast man, a man with the mind of a beast. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven, meaning he never washed himself, and he was covered with dew from the ground and rain from the skies. And until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle, and his nail like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, so I don't know how long that lasted for. 7 times could mean 7 years. It could. Later on, we're going to see time kind of somewhat meaning years, but I don't really know that for sure. It could mean 7 months. It could mean 7 weeks. It could mean 7 days. It could mean nothing. I mean, it could mean just a perfect period of time. I don't know how long this actually lasted. It could mean that he could have been doing it for 20 years, as far as I know. We don't have a lot of information about the second half of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. We do know that apparently he was ill at some point later in his reign. There are brief references to an illness he may have suffered. There is an indication that he may have been a little crazy at the end of his reign, which is probably referring to this. I don't know if we know how long that lasted for. It could have been 20 years for all we know. I don't know. Like I said, we don't really have much information about the last half of his reign. We know from the Bible that he was going to attack Egypt after his siege of Tyre, so this is probably after that, and that was in 568 BC. So it's probably after that. It's probably near the end of his life. I don't think we should necessarily insist that this was a literal 7-year or 7-month period. I think the idea of the 7 times means it took as long as it needed to take for Nebuchadnezzar to get the point. And whether that happened in a day, I think it would have been a while, because part of the lesson that's being taught here is that God doesn't have to rule through a competent human leader like Nebuchadnezzar. From all the indications I get in Scripture and elsewhere, is that Nebuchadnezzar was actually a pretty competent ruler. Probably even, I would say even like an above average, like an unusually skilled ruler. Like I said before, he was very proud of his building projects. He was less concerned about documenting his exploits as a warrior, but we know he was successful at that too. And when Cyrus came into authority in Babylon as an invading force years later, he appealed to Nebuchadnezzar as like his predecessor and not the guys in between him and Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar would have died 25 years or so before that. So it seems as though Nebuchadnezzar, despite, of course, his tantrum and his cruel tendencies, which all rulers had at that time, seems to have been an unusually competent ruler that apparently people generally liked. He seems to have known how to hold a kingdom together. He knew how to build a kingdom. He built the kingdom of Babylon. Of course, his father started that process, but he continued it and did it very successfully and held it together throughout his lifetime. It seems to have been unusually competent in administering a kingdom in a way that his successors were not, which is why the kingdom fell apart after his death. But the point being taught here is that God doesn't have to rule through a competent, capable, controlling leader like Nebuchadnezzar apparently was. He can rule through a madman. He can rule through an idiot, a dunce, if he has to. It's up to God's choosing to decide who gets to be the ruler. He apparently picked I think he picked Nebuchadnezzar partially because Nebuchadnezzar was competent. He designed Nebuchadnezzar to be a competent ruler, gave him those abilities, intending for him to fulfill that role. I also think he did it because he knew that eventually Nebuchadnezzar, unlike a lot of these rulers, would get the point, as he does here at the end of this chapter. I think God allowed him to be this dominant force because eventually his will would be expressed through Nebuchadnezzar in a way that the other leaders usually did not end up acknowledging him. So, at the end of that time, however long it was, whether it was 7 years or 7 months or 7 weeks or whatever, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. So he somehow had an idea. He had some kind of awareness that something was wrong with him. And eventually, he appealed to heaven for forgiveness, I guess. And my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion as an eternal dominion. Now, the kingdom of Babylon is going to fade away. We already predicted that with this vision of this statue in chapter 2. We're going to see that happen in chapter 5. And the kingdoms that replace Babylon are also going to fade away. The God's kingdom is not going to fade away. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Daniel probably had a lot to do with that because Daniel was there the whole time. Daniel may even have been running the kingdom largely in Nebuchadnezzar's absence. Nebuchadnezzar had a son. They actually read about him in Jeremiah and 2 Kings. Nebuchadnezzar had a son named Evil Merodach, who actually was his immediate successor. Daniel says nothing about this guy, but we do know about him, and Scripture does refer to him. He was the guy who set Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, free from captivity that Nebuchadnezzar had placed him in. That's how the book of 2 Kings ends. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, this is 562 BC. This is when, after Nebuchadnezzar has died. In the year Evil Merodach became king of Babylon, that's Nebuchadnezzar's son, he released Jehoiachin from prison on the 27th day of the 12th month. So Nebuchadnezzar had a son who may have been old enough, probably was, to help administer the kingdom in his father's madness, and Daniel would have been there too. So they probably held the kingdom together while Nebuchadnezzar was off in the gardens, maybe? The hanging gardens, who knows? I don't really know. Somewhere. I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and just, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. I have no idea. I honestly do not know if Nebuchadnezzar legitimately became a convert to Jehovah or not. I just have no idea. He seems to have finally accepted that Israel's God, or Daniel's God, was at least the greatest of all the gods. In chapter 2, he acknowledged him as the revealer of mysteries. In chapter 3, he acknowledged him as the rescuer from fire. In chapter 4, he finally acknowledges him as the Most High. I don't know if that means he ever became a true convert to Daniel's God or not. I tend to think not, but he may have. He may have. We'll know when we get there. Maybe he's there. I don't know. I just don't know. It does seem from the inscriptions that he became less enthused with Marduk as time went on. One of the things that we read about the inscriptions is that, Marduk chose Cyrus to restore his honor in the city of Babylon in days to come. So that could indicate that Nebuchadnezzar eventually fell away from Marduk. I don't know. I really honestly don't. I don't think the language in Daniel 4 is quite clear enough to state definitively that Nebuchadnezzar did finally become a believer in Daniel's God and leave his other gods behind. I just don't know if it's clear enough to say that. But at least he did acknowledge that God was the Most High. He got to a point finally in his life where he no longer sought to fight against Daniel's God and surrendered to him as being the ultimate authority. Other kings don't do that. His sons is not going to do that. The people who rule Babylon after him are not going to do that. We're going to read about that in Daniel 5, as we read about another guy named Belshazzar who is not going to do that. I don't think Cyrus did that. I don't think the guys who replaced Cyrus did that. That's not common, actually. There are not that many examples. Even in the Judean kings, there's a lot of them that turn away from God and just never go back on that. So Nebuchadnezzar is unusual in that regard. This, again, I believe is probably the reason why God, knowing that was going to happen in his omniscience, probably the reason why he chose to work to Nebuchadnezzar in the first place, is that he knew eventually Nebuchadnezzar would get to a point where he would honor God in a way that a lot of these ancient kings never did. So, that's it for Nebuchadnezzar. He's gone. We've been talking about him for a long time. We finally see him in Daniel, at the end of chapter 8, Daniel 1. Daniel's in there in front of them, in front of the king. And then he's a prominent figure in 2, 3, and 4, and that's it. He's gone. Nebuchadnezzar his story is finished. He finally reached the point where he acknowledged the God of heaven as supreme over the affairs of men, and that's the point of his story. It's like that's the culmination of Nebuchadnezzar's contribution to the Bible. So, chapter 5, we're just going to skip right past him and his immediate successors and get down to the last day of Babylon.